My name is Kathy Hirsch. I'm the interviewer for West Volusia Historical Society interview with Mark Shuttleworth. Today is March 24th, 2025, and we are in the lovely DeLand house. Tell us a little bit about your early life, where you were born, and you were on a farm.
Yeah, well, as I told you, I was born in Ingersoll, Ontario, which is about 100 miles from Windsor and 100 miles from Buffalo, kind of approximately off. And I lived on an 87-acre farm. I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters, and my father bought the farm after the war. He was in the Canadian Air Force, and prior to that in the British Air Force, and was in the Battle of Britain, and just anyway, he stayed on in the auxiliary after that, but he got into farming, and we lived on the farm until I was 13 years old.
What were your responsibilities?
It was typical farm kid. You know, you'd collect up eggs from the chickens and, help with the cows and herd them. And, my father didn't quite stay with farming consistently, because at that point the whole farm thing in the 50s and early 60s was shifting economically, and it wasn't what it used to be, where 87 acres could really guarantee you a good living. So at one point we had cattle. At one point we had 1,000 guinea hens, because my father would take them to Toronto, about 100 miles away, and guinea hens were the fashionable, kind of like pheasant, you could say, in some fancy restaurants in Toronto. But 1,000 guinea hens are pretty noisy. So I still hear them sometimes when I sleep, I think. But it was a great experience with my brothers and sisters being on the farm. I just have a romantic vision of it, which of course is a kid's approach to it. But it was just wonderful in the springtime. Of course, we had lots of snow, because it's kind of sort of like being in Pennsylvania. You get the lake effect with the snow, and so I remember lots of snowdrift. But the idea of the springtime with the warm breezes and the ice is coming up, and iris are coming out through the ice, and just so I loved being on the farm. And I helped out with haying, which I seem to remember a lot about haying, because we had a wagon, and sometimes I'd steer the tractor. That was part of my job. Sometimes we were helping with the baling, and a lot of times we were up in the loft, and they would swing with the old-fashioned hook that would drop the bales, and we'd swing it into the corner, that kind of thing.
You said you went to a 2-room schoolhouse. That's pretty romantic.
Yeah, it was right up on the next hill. We were kind of on a hill. For some reason, I've always liked antique houses, and I realized that the farmhouse when I was a kid was an 1880s farmhouse. And it was up on a hill, and walnut trees lined the driveway coming in. It was just beautiful. And the 2-room country school, grade 1 through 5 was in one room, and 6 through 8 was in the other room. It was Canadian education. It was really a good education. Very, how do I want to say? We wouldn't have thought of acting out. For sure. It was, it was an English system. As I told you on the phone, my parents moved in 1963 down to Florida. And part of that idea was my mother wanted all of us, all 6 kids, to have the opportunity to go to college. And in Canada, it was the old traditional English system. And really, they had private universities, but there wasn't, at that point, a very adequate national educational system for college.
So why Florida?
I'm sorry?
Why Florida?
Well, the year before we came down, we all came down with colds and the flu. It was a miserable winter. It was horrible. And my parents, in the middle of that, came to Lakeland to see my father's father. more or less my grandfather was retired in Lakeland with his second wife. And, they came down here and the sun was shining and, it was Florida and it was gorgeous. And my mother said, aha, this is it. So she kind of schemed and cajoled my father into moving. And so that's how we ended up in Florida in 1963.
And how old were you?
I went into junior high school in September of that year, so, or late August, I guess it was. So yeah, I would have been 14, I guess, yeah.
And you went to Stetson. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I went to Stetson. When I was in school, my biology teacher, who was an older woman, was just a rather brilliant woman, and somehow I related to her, and she kind of got stern with me a few times to be a good student. And one time she said, "You could go to Stetson like I did if you'd behave yourself." So, and somewhere in there I shaped up enough that I went and took a tour of Stetson and said, yeah, this is it. I wanted to go to a small school. I'd heard about University of Florida, of course, but just the idea of thousands of students, just didn't appeal to me at all.
Especially after having gone to a two-room schoolhouse.
Yeah, and yes, exactly. Maybe that was part of it. And again, I loved the older buildings at Stetson. I ended up having a work-study program and a bit of a scholarship, and then I worked construction in West Palm Beach in the summertime. And that gave me, back then, private education wasn't as expensive as it is now, and I was able to make enough money to pay my tuition, and
What was the atmosphere at Stetson like in those years?
Well, it was the late 60s. That was 1967. I was there from 67 to 71, and then came back in the late 70s to finish a graduate degree in education, a Master of Arts. But in the late 60s, Stetson was certainly a quiet, conservative school. When we went there, the Florida Baptist Convention was still a strong supporter of the school. I think a lot of us as students did enough to irritate the Florida Baptist Convention that over the next 5 or 6 years, they decided they wouldn't support Stetson anymore. And, it was the late 60s, so it was that period of civil rights were absolutely an issue. Stetson had integrated at that point, had several years before, and certainly professors had made any inroads they could in terms of being involved with civil rights issues. Obviously, the Vietnam War was going on. That dominated all the time at school. All of us, various, they had the lottery, that notorious lottery for the draft at one point.
Were you involved in the anti-war stuff?
Yeah, I got pretty involved. I was the summer before my junior year, I was an intern in Washington, a congressional intern working for a congressman. His name was Paul Rogers from Palm Beach area. And so I did the normal stuff of being an intern there, running errands, doing jobs, going to various receptions, whatever. But I joined the Vietnam Moratorium Committee. It was stationed in Washington. It was a very small outfit at that point. And they were preparing to have nationwide protests on campus. And I had done a lot of research in college on the Vietnam War, and I just felt like it was a ridiculous war and just ill-founded, and it was never going to be a successful war. Vietnam, the problem is, I don't think the United States read it very well. I mean, you had the various Buddhist sects and the Montagnards, the mountain people, and just too many groups in dissent, and it was an Asian country that just to try to impose American government and values just led to a lot of corruption in Saigon, particularly. And it just seemed like it was a bad war, and obviously a lot of my friends were there, and my older sister's friends, some of which were killed in the war.
You did not go?
No, I did not go. No, I at one point I had a religion deferment. At one point I had thought I was going to go in the Episcopal priesthood, and I was what they called it in the Episcopal Church, a postulant for holy orders, meaning I was headed to seminary once I got out of school. I ended up not making that choice to do that, but I had a deferment, and another time my number came up, and I decided I wasn't going to go. I just, at that point, I didn't have to decide, but it was either go to Canada or go to jail. And I kind of thought I'd go to jail, but I didn't have to prove anything. You know.
It was a hard time.
Yeah, it was a hard time. I tended to get pretty heavily involved in politics at that point on the campus, and was president of a couple of classes, and was involved in student government, and you know, I still like politics. I still believe government can function and be effective. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I couldn't imagine not being a Democrat. I just honestly don't understand republicanism. It seems all about making money and then doing everything you can to hold on to it. And if other people suffer, well, that's too bad. And to me, that seems kind of stupid and short-sighted and not very Christian, frankly. Anyway.
So you had what you described as sort of vagabond years. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I probably narrated more of that than I should have to you. But yeah, I when I got out of Stetson, I was kind of searching for something to do, and my youngest brother and also my youngest sister were in a private progressive school. It was very, very progressive, very loose school, and I ended up teaching there.
That was in the Palm Beach area?
Yeah, in West Palm Beach, and I taught there when I got out of school, out of undergraduate school, and I taught there for a year. But I was kind of restless. I had been in school, and I just felt like kicking out, and I had the opportunity to crew on a boat. There was 3 other people, and the captain, this was a 63-foot demasted schooner, an old wooden schooner that had the mast cut off, and somebody put in a huge diesel engine in it. And he wanted to take it to the Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, where he lived, and use it as an inter-island cargo schooner, which was kind of a crazy idea. But so I ended up crewing on the boat to get to the Virgin Islands. And then when I got there, he said, "Okay, bye." And all of a sudden, I was on my own and had to figure out what to do then. And I ended up hanging drywall for several weeks, and ended up for about a month scraping barnacles in a dry dock. It was mostly for beer and hamburger once a day. It was And
this was in the U.S. Virgin Islands?
This was in St. Thomas in Charlotte Amalia, the main harbor there. I lived for most of that time. I lived on a little raft that was a 4x8 sheet of plywood, and it had a couple of empty oil barrels under it, metal barrels. And it was out at the marina, at the far end of the marina. So when the big ocean liners would come into Charlotte Amalia, their wake, even though they're coming slow, their wake would throw me off the plywood. I was sleeping in a lounge chair and it would throw me into the water. But it was warm water, so so I got used to sleeping in my bathing suit. As ridiculous as that sounds, when you're, whatever it was, I guess it was 23 at that point, your tolerance for things is pretty good. And anyway, I ended up, after about 6 or 7 weeks there, I ended up getting a chance to crew on a boat in the British Virgin Islands. A bank teller there had this 28-foot westerly sloop, and he wanted to go south all the way to Grenada, which was about 600 miles south of there. And I thought, hey, what the heck? And at that point, I got in the idea, my father and mother had gotten divorced later when I was a senior in high school. And so he had moved to Venezuela to set up a citrus processing plant in Caripe near Maturin, which is the far eastern side of Venezuela. Kind of an area kind of like Florida, a lot of hills and rather warm climate, a lot of sandy soil in some areas. So I was determined to see him, because at that point it had been 6 years, I guess, since I'd seen him. And so I decided to go to Grenada and then try to figure out how to get from Grenada. Well, when I got to Grenada, as I told you, I've learned never to tell an immigration officer the truth, which is, I told him I had 25 cents in my pocket, which was the truth. And so I ended up getting deported. They stamped on my passport, liable to be a burden on the public welfare, in big letters. And so they made the captain, the guy I was on, made him buy me passage on a local cargo schooner. This was one with a telephone pole as a mast. And women would come on with their hair in bandanas, and they'd have goats and fruits and vegetables and things to take to Port of Spain. That was the next port to the south in Trinidad. And it was 92 miles, so I ended up getting passage to Trinidad. And then I got to Trinidad and got interrogated by that immigration officer. And I still didn't learn my lesson, because I told him I didn't have any money. And so they put me under boat arrest, and I had to stay there 2 weeks while the captain took on crew and got another job to go back to haul stuff back to Grenada. So I went back to the island I was already deported from. So, yeah. So that was sort of interesting.
And then you eventually wound up back in the States.
Yeah, well, I finally got some money from a friend of mine, and she sent some money, and I got a plane ticket to Trinidad at Port of Spain. Then I went to Caracas, and then I took a Porpuesto, a native taxi, kind of you share with 5 or 6 other sweaty people. And I found my father and stayed with my father for several weeks after that. So it was quite an experience, yeah.
So you did have some rather short career teaching at Daytona State College.
Yeah, when I came back, I started graduate school, and I did some substitute teaching here in high schools around here, just as a filler, and I was also painting houses, mostly antique houses around DeLand to fill in. And so I went to see one of my professors, George Hood, Dr. George Hood, who was a fantastic person. And I said, I can't figure out what to do in life. And he said, oh, you're perfect for graduate school. So on his recommendation, I got into graduate school, which I loved. I had a good time in graduate school. I really liked it. I was actually focused, and I was really interested in social work. And I found my problems were nothing compared to other people's problems. And so social work is a good thing to go into if you want to straighten yourself out and realize, you know, there
You
were.
mentioned an incident that you had with a black friend where he went out late at night to get something to eat. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was a friend of mine named Gary Johnson who he was at Mercer University, and he and I had met through the Vietnam protests because he was leading some protests at his school, and so he would come visit periodically.
Here in
About once
DeLand?
yeah, he'd come to DeLand and stay a few days, and he and I were out. Back then, DeLand, you know, the university was certainly an oasis, but there were still, it wasn't as progressive as the town feels like it is now, let's put it that way. And he and I were out at what was called the truck stop then, which was then a place where truck drivers came through, and the point is the restaurant was open all night long because it was a truck stop. So he and I went out there because it's the only place to eat it, and it was late as 11 or 12 at night, I guess. And we went out there, and it's just that kind of thing of, you know, the waitress wouldn't bring us silverware, and then they brought silverware for me, but not for him. I asked for a glass of water. They didn't bring him one. I had to ask them for a glass of water. You know, that kind of routine. We finally had food and, you know, basically breakfast. It was sort of bacon and egg kind of thing because it was late. And, you know, by the time we left, people were throwing bottles at us. There was just some guys hanging out there, and we, you know, it was not a big deal, but it was just, that's what it was. The idea that I would show up with a black person at a truck stop.
What was that an isolated incident, would you say, or was that kind of typical of things that were going on at the time?
Somewhere in between, I suspect. That was the only specific incident for me. You know, later when I was married, we moved to Lake Helen, and sort of a similar thing happened to me in Lake Helen. There was a place called the Alibi Lounge, which was in Lake Helen, and it was kind of a rough old beat-up bar.
Interesting name.
Yeah, yeah. And kind of the same thing, you know, there was no attempt at violence, but it was obvious that the whole bar was quiet when I walked in with a black friend, and it was just, you know. I wasn't looking for trouble, but I probably knew that maybe it would be an issue, and I just kind of am tired of that kind of thing, frankly. So.
So tell us about when you met your wife and you got married.
Yeah, my wife was an artist, and she was showing at what is now the Bank of America, you know, on a Saturday afternoon. It was hot. She'd been doing sidewalk art shows since she was 16 years old, and I was 28 at that point, and she was also. And she was showing her work, and I asked her, well, what was going on? And she said, well, there's just old guys from Deltona and Bermuda shorts and ice cream cones. That's all I've seen all day. So, you know, I had some corny line. She had a back of an antique car, and I said, that looks like a Barbara Stanwyck kind of movie car, you know. So somehow she liked that idea. She wanted, frankly, it was attraction at first sight. It was like, wow, okay. And she wanted to photograph in Cassadaga, so we just closed up. It was about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. She just decided it was going to be not a good show anyway, so I whisked her away to Cassadaga, and we went filming there. She photographed in Cassadaga because she was interested in spiritualism, and so pretty fast. We got married about 6 months later, and we moved to Lake Helen. We had the opportunity to buy an 1895 farmhouse in almost 2 acres from a lady. It was kind of the last of the old deals for houses in Lake Helen, and an older woman was anxious to move to John Knox Village over in Tampa, so we got a good deal on the house, you know.
And you became involved in politics there.
Yeah, I got involved with the community. Lake Helen's this sort of wonderful place where you get involved immediately, and it has a way of growing on you where you become protective of the town, and it's still less than 3,000 people, and
how have they managed to do that? Did you have a role in that?
Well, I did. Yeah, I was. In the 90s, I started to get involved in local government. We started a historic preservation group, and we raised money, had car washes and all that, enough to have. It was actually Sidney Johnson that ended up getting hired to do a historic district survey in Lake Helen. And after that, I decided to run for city government and ran for city commission, and spent 15 years on the city commission, of which about 8 years were 4 two-year terms as a mayor. And we got involved at that point, Deltona was really expanding. It was very aggressive about putting out utility service areas and putting out for the future where they wanted to expand. And we were really threatened by that. And everybody in town wanted to stay slow growth and wanted to be not suburbia and did not want to look or be like Deltona. So I spent a lot of time as mayor having, we had a lot of growth management studies, and we did a survey, and we were able to change the very nature of the growth for the city, and they still have kept it up even 20 some odd years later.
That's pretty amazing.
They've kept
the
the
growth
same.
going on all around.
They've kept the same pattern. Yeah, people in Lake Helen enjoy the quality of life right there, and the point is you can drive 3 miles and get public supermarket and all the stuff you want that the city provides, but you can drive back home and have a nice quiet little town where kids can ride their bicycle at night on the streets, and women could walk the dog at midnight and they don't get hassled by anybody, and it's kept that nice kind of. Some people call it Mayberry, but that's okay with me. And most people there are quite glad to have it be Mayberry. Thank you, So it's a wonderful town. I really enjoyed being mayor in the sense I put in a lot of time with it. We spent a lot of time on environmental issues and slow growth issues and protecting the town. And I feel good about that. I feel like I made a real contribution at the time. We were able to build a big equestrian center there, so a lot of the people that have horses are quite happy with that, and that was a major development, and we restored a lot of buildings, and so it helped the town to prosper. Yeah.
You tell us about how you sort of accidentally got into the salvage business.
Yeah, well, I was teaching at I taught at Daytona State College for, I think I was there about 2.5, 3, about 3 years I was there. And I was involved with the CETA job training program as one of the administrators, one of the helpers to the administrator for that. So I had a professor status, and we would teach classes and organize the classes, and then I taught adjunct faculty teaching on my own at night. But a friend of mine was a contractor, and also he taught several construction-related classes. And I was looking for a bathtub for our house, for the farmhouse, an old clawfoot bathtub. And he told me about this mansion that he was salvaging, so I went by to look at it. And then about a week later, I went by, and he said, "Mark, you can have anything you want in the house for $250. You can have the whole house, but I got to tell you, the bulldozers are coming tomorrow morning, It was an outfit out of Jacksonville called Realco Wrecking. I'm not sure if they're still in business now, but they're a big, huge demolition firm. And so that was the middle of the afternoon after school, after work, and I called my wife and I said, could she bring my tools over? And I had a pickup truck and basic tools. I really didn't know what I was doing. But what the heck, for $250, I thought, well, this will be interesting. So I stayed up all night long with a flashlight and just worked all night long. And it was beautiful stuff, leaded glass, bevel glass, woodwork, antique doors that were varnished. This was actually was a Jewish temple. It was Temple Israel in Daytona, but it was in a two-story colonial revival house overlooking the river. So it was a gorgeous place. And I just worked all the next day, all the next night, and finally just sort of passed out. But I'd pulled everything out away from the house, so if the bulldozers came, at least I could save what I'd pulled out. And in my naive businessman's way, I put an ad in the Orlando Sentinel. That was back when classified ads still worked, you know. That was in 1981. And lo and behold, a woman who was a contractor in Longwood building antique-style reproduction houses showed up and bought a lot of stuff. And a man that was restoring a mansion in Oakland responded to the ad. And a guy that was building Victorian-era houses in downtown Orlando bought things. And frankly, it was a couple of times my normal monthly salary from a DBCC professor. So I thought, hey, this is okay. And I dove into the salvage business. It was absolutely raw capitalism in the sense they were, right then in Daytona, they decided to build the Ocean Center. So they were starting to bulldoze blocks after blocks of beachside cottages there, and the whole area they needed for the Ocean Center. So these houses were just available for pittance. The demo firms, you'd kind of pay $50 or $100 and get a whole house for salvage. So I was there, and I met a bunch of other guys like myself, so it was sort of honor among thieves. You know, we would all work all day and then argue about who was supposed to get the glass doorknobs and who got the doors, and we'd fuss with each other, and then we'd have a cold beer and do the same thing the next day. It was a lot of fun. I was 32 years old, and I loved business because it was totally different than being on a regular guaranteed paycheck at the community college. I enjoyed the academic atmosphere, but the idea of you work, you maybe make money, maybe not. I learned a lot with my wallet. I was absolutely broke for the next 3 or 4 years because my wife decided to go to graduate school at Gainesville to get a Master of Fine Arts in photography. So she was off not making money. I wasn't making money except what I could hustle. So it was a lot of fun. You know, I think when you're young, you have this bubble of stupid innocence that just protects you. You look back later and you go, my God, how did I survive that? But it was what it was.
You mentioned in our earlier conversation that your mother, you used to go with your mother to look for antiques, and she sold some antique things. You think that influence affected?
Well, I told you, but I guess it did, because my mother back in Canada, she was an antique dealer, and she loved good quality things, and we would go to farm auctions. And as I told you, I learned as a kid that you don't pick your nose, and you don't put your hand up in your hair, and you certainly don't raise your arm for any reason whatsoever at an auction. Because even if you're a kid, the auctioneer is looking to have a fake bid so he can get the bidding going, so you're the target if you don't watch it. So you
developed early on an appreciation for old things.
Yeah, and my mother ended up having an antique business downtown for a couple of years before we left Canada, and then actually when we moved to Florida after a couple of years, when I went to college, she moved over to West Palm Beach with my younger brothers and sisters, and she was a designer in Palm Beach, working with, frankly, the carriage trades and quite an aristocratic group in Palm Beach. And back then Palm Beach was a lot of older, traditional, aristocratic, wealthy families. It kind of has sort of changed under the Trump regime, you know.
But she managed to fit in, it sounds like.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. My mother's father was, they spent most of their time in Europe when she was a kid. He ended up being in charge of General Motors for all of Europe at one point, and was personally kicked out by Hitler. So, yeah, he would have to go to these Nazi rallies as a representative of Vauxhall, which was a German car firm. I'm not sure of all the details, but he insisted on his limousine carrying him. He always had a Union Jack. He refused to fly a Nazi flag. And eventually, you know, he was ordered out of the country. So,
That's an interesting family story.
Oh yeah, for about a year and a half, he and my mother and my grandmother, they had bags packed all the time. That was their escape luggage to get out, and they had a map all figured out where they were going to go. I think they were mostly in Austria at that point, but they had figured out to go to France and try to escape.
But getting kicked out.
Well, the kick out was just, no, they weren't, there was not a threat of, it was more diplomatic of leave or else, because Hitler wanted to take over all the factories and nationalize everything for the Socialist Party, the Democrat, I forget, the Nazi Party.
You mentioned that your involvement with the West Volusia Historical Society. Tell us about the projects you've become involved with, especially here in DeLand House.
Yeah, well, DeLand House, I got involved here because I was asked to be on the board, and I always liked what the Historic Society did. I had known Sidney Johnson for years and years, and he's incredibly well respected in Tallahassee as a researcher for historic projects. And also, I was just curious to be a board member just to kind of see what happens here. I mean, I'd come here and done a little research now and then. I was friends with Bill Dreggers for years. I remember him because I was in the salvage business, and they first were working on this, about 30 years ago, I guess. Yeah, early 90s, I guess it would be, right? That the first 89, maybe late 80s. I know I donated several doors here, and then later he had me help with the Naval Museum up at the airport. I mean, it was no big deal. It's just I was glad to help. Bill was he was kind of person you couldn't say no to. You know, he just smiled at you, and you kind of felt like you better just help him out. And I liked him, you know, and he would always tell a story. He was certainly good at telling stories. And so I've always liked history anyway. I mean, again, I told you I've lived apparently in older houses most of my life, and I think history is important. I like to know things, and it's fun to dig up secrets and make sense of why things have happened or might happen in the future. And so it's glad to be a board member. I'm pretty sure they mostly recruited me because I had men that worked and had a trailer and a truck. I think that was the real reason. Anyway, I was glad to help, but you know, when I came on the board, they had decided to do further restoration of the building, and they wanted to be more specific about the time period that it represented. And so that was a challenge. Particularly, I enjoyed the idea of thinking about lighting and what room should have what style of lighting. How formal would it be? Less formal upstairs in the bedroom area or in the studies. And the other people I worked with were just very open to suggestions that I might make. So I really enjoyed the process of going through it. And they did a lot of work, more work than what I did. I supplied stuff and tried to help out and tried to buy some things and to help out that way. And I just enjoyed it. And my foreman enjoyed working on the floors, and we got an antique toilet for the upstairs and an antique sink to replace the modern ones that were upstairs. So it was all about trying to create that period and try to be as precise as we could for that particular age group.
I think
which I enjoy doing that, you know.
the job is very well done. The whole house is incredible.
Oh, it's gorgeous. You know, there were some decisions I thought I would stay out of, like the wallpaper, for instance. I think they did a great job on wallpaper, and I honestly didn't know any more about wallpaper than anybody, so I thought they did a great job on particularly wallpaper and which furnishings to do. And I think the idea of having tours and having people enter into an experience and just do their own kind of personal time traveling for half an hour is pretty powerful stuff if you can create that environment. And I think the docents have done a great job of doing that, you know.
Tell us about your involvement with the Wright Project in the Black community here in DeLand.
Yeah, I was again. I seem to like old buildings. I mean, I helped supply some lighting to the old county courthouse restoration, and back in 2002 or 3, I helped restore the train station, the Amtrak train station, all the canopy there and they had gotten a DOT grant, and anyway, I was able to do some work. My company spent about $100,000. I don't think I made any money on the project, but I had a heck of a good time, and we did it right. I was proud of what we did. We replaced all the passenger canopy area where you wait for the train, and I insisted that we do it all in cypress because I felt the cypress wood would last a lot longer. And then I worked with Julie Schofield and her son, who was working for an Eagle Scout badge, and so he helped paint all the interior of the lobby there, and I arranged to get reproduction doors to match the existing I think the train station was, I forget now, 1916, I think, era. So I had a millwork company in Sanford make the doors out of sapelli wood, which is sort of a mahogany type wood. So we did some really good work on it to keep that same period look.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's still nice. I go down there every once in a while and grumble at them because they don't clean the cobwebs and there's a few wasps around and stuff. And every couple of years I take my crew there and we do that for them just because I'm proud of it. So
I just took the train from there to
Oh, yeah.
Washington
Oh,
2
yeah.
weeks ago.
It's a great train, isn't it? Yeah, I like that. I did that once myself, and it was wonderful. Anyway, I keep getting involved in other projects around the town, and I had I knew James Wright, who was the grandson of Wright that built the building, and in 1925. No, I'm sorry, 1920, and I had given him some pallets of white brick that matched some of the bricks in the Wright building because I was hoping to get in to see the Wright building. I mean, I love to snoop in old buildings, you know. Just, again, I love the cobwebs and just the fact of the history and the ghosts that are hidden there. And but he never would let me in, so I was always curious about it. And then,
Why was that?
pardon me?
Why didn't he let you in?
he was just very protective of it, and he kept saying it was dangerous. And he was certainly right about that part, but you know, I'm stupid and foolish, so that didn't bother me that somebody told me it was dangerous. Well, in the salvage business, you go in all kinds of decrepit places that are falling apart, and you can either not do it, or you can just figure out how to be safe and not get hurt and do it. So I was never worried about that. So anyway, I was approached by Mauro Davis one day to help out with it, and I kind of put him off for several months. And then he asked me again, and I thought, well, I'll come take a look. And at that point, the building was really falling apart. The roof had caved in 10 or 15 years before. It was termite damage everywhere, rotted. The floors had caved in. It was in pretty desperate shape. I think if it had gone another 2 or 3 years, the way that was, it would have been way too late. The church, when they bought the building on a tax deed, they had a CP, I always get their initials wrong. Anyway, the engineering consulting firm do a study, and they suggested they bulldoze the building. That was their report, was bulldoze the building, save some bricks for a little memorial wall or something. Anyway, we got into it. I thought, well, wait a minute, you just need to clean up the building. Let's clear it out and see what's going on structurally. And the church had some money available. The Greater Union Baptist Church had around 175 to maybe 200,000 they had available. And so we used that money to save the building, which was do an emergency stabilization of it. And then I wrote a little grant to the city, and we got $20,000 from the city community redevelopment agency for an underutilized building project. And if you could say you were going to bring a building back into commercial use of some sort, that was what the money was for. So that helped to do it. And then I wrote a grant to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They awarded us $100,000 to help put a roof on it and save the building, and also to restore the windows and doors on the north side. I was careful to write the grant for the north and west wing, because those were the most prominent ones that faced the street, plus the ones in back had a lot of other brick problems and structural problems to them. So we were successful and got that grant money, and then a couple of years later, I really got involved in the last part of 2017, and so anyway, I was involved with 6 or so years in it, and we got. I ended up a couple of years ago writing a grant application to the state government, and we were able to get, it was a specifically targeted African American grant supplied by the state, and it was no local match, because at that point the church had spent what money they had and there was no other money available, but we were able to get a $500,000 grant, which my understanding they're still working on now to use.
You're no longer involved with the project?
No, I'm not sure what happened exactly. I know there was I had disagreement with them. They wanted to have, the architect, who's a friend of mine, had prescribed it. They need handicap access to the second floor, so he had designed a wheelchair lift to the second floor, not something to go up a staircase, but like an elevator, but it's called a lula. It's cheaper and easier to put those in, and it would transport a person in a wheelchair and an attendant or 3 adults. So I thought, hey, 3 at a time, why not? That's sufficient, and it was on budget. That was on an area that the grant would not cover. The state grant was all about restoring the original building. So there was no money to put on a back porch that that everybody wanted to have, because we thought we could have choir singing or public presentations to the backyard, which was paved and needed work. But the point is, it would have been a great public assembly place to have a speaker or an event on the second floor overlooking. But they needed a wheelchair lift to get there. And some people on the board wanted to have a big commercially rated elevator that would cost a couple $100,000 and because for a total redesign of all the porch. And there were just a few other issues that were, I had a group of contractors that were willing, some local contractors that were willing to donate their time and frankly labor and money to finish the building. We were all kind of simpatico with each other, and we were all committed to finishing the project in 1 year, and they all kind of pledged. One of them was a contractor, Rick Basso out of Lake Helen, and Mike Chinelli, who's a builder here in town, and several others. And I'm not sure what happened, but the board decided not to support that or even deal with it, which I was incredibly frustrated when they did that.
And so it's just sitting.
Pardon me?
It's
Yeah.
just sitting empty now.
I don't know what's going on. They have not communicated with me at all. I've resigned. At the time, my wife was having some health problems, and that was a factor. Frankly, I was really frustrated with the board because I had somehow worn out my welcome, and they were not sharing with me. There was a whole nother agenda I wasn't aware. We were having some disagreements with the state program that ran it, one of the administrators, about the back porch because they were concerned that it was so big. And we were back and forth trying to have a dialogue about the architecture and what they would accept and what we could modify. And I don't know if somehow that bothered some board members that they thought we were not cooperating with the state. I don't know. Again, no one's really told me. So I've had no communication with anybody. Frankly, I'm disappointed in one thing, which I was on the board of directors for a couple of years of the Greater Union Life Center that owns the building. And I thought I had established some good friendships with some of the board members. And I'm kind of disappointed none of them have said anything to me. They didn't call up and say, gee, I'm sorry, blah, blah, blah happened, or it was just silence. So it's sort of, just being honest, I got some hurt feelings because I spent a lot of time, a lot of my own money, a lot of my labor crew that worked for free, a lot in there. They just don't realize what it takes. Every time there was a tour of the building, I did it. Every time there was a windstorm coming in or a hurricane, I battened down the place. We just spent a lot of time because I was into the building. It was a gorgeous, and still could be a gorgeous building. I got some people to donate a lot of antique flooring to it and other supplies. It still could be a hell of a building. And we had a lot of interaction with the business school at Stetson, and they still, I think, are interested in doing something on the upper floor there. We designed a whole series of offices that would be, there'd be an office there for Greater Union Life Center itself, but also an idea to have an effect on the community, to have a incubator, if you will, for young startup businesses in that community, which is predominantly Black and Latino in that area. And that's still out there, that maybe something could happen with Stetson on that, which I think would help. But I don't know what they're doing with that.
Can you give us your professional assessment of where DeLand is as a city in terms of preserving not only its history, but its cachet, its charm?
Well, I'm kind of a cheerleader for the city most of the time in that regard. I think they've been first of all, the city has gotten lots of grants itself for historic preservation, and the Main Street Association has been an absolute wonderful thing to have happen to DeLand. I mean, DeLand, if I understand it, was the very first Main Street Association in the whole state, the very first one to start. They were kind of the reason that I bought my building in DeLand. I was renting a beat up old warehouse in Sanford that I started in '81, but I was just renting it, and this was a beat up rotten old building. It was a start, but it was hotter than hell there in the summertime and cold as hell in the winter, and it was a good start for somebody with no money. But you know, as I slowly figured out business, I was ready to move and had the opportunity to buy a building in downtown, but also I thought about moving closer to Orlando, where there's just more going on at the time, at least. But the Main Street Association held out their hand and said, hey, we have this grant money to fix up your front window, and we can help you with this, and we'll help you with advertising. And so I ended up buying this beat up building that had been an auto parts store that went bankrupt, frankly. And it was in a beat up area, but I was the first one there, and I didn't know what I was doing, but it was a place to have my business. And slowly that seemed to be a start, a catalyst for other people building in that area. So it went from being a bunch of beat up warehouses that were boarded up to slowly becoming a nighttime entertainment place, and the marketplace on Friday night now is really successful, and a lot of arts and entertainment, cultural things happen there all the time, and wedding events and social events. And
did you have a hand in the development of Artisan Alley, working with Barb Shepherd?
Yeah, I did, although Barb is a really incredible person. I love her. I think she's great. She was my landlord for a while because I rented some of her buildings to store my old beat up lumber and beams. And then she did a very benevolent eviction of me. And I got replaced by a belly dancer studio was put in there. And then that became what is now a bake shop in that area. But when I had it, I had just beat up old boards in there. But that shows you over the progression over about a 10-year period it happened. And Barb's just, she's very ethical and very open-minded about business and supportive of people. And so she's just an amazing person. And her investment group is very much local, which I like. It's local, people are invested there, and it's been a huge catalyst for the downtown, that whole area. I at one point had a man from New York he lived here part of the year down here, and frankly he had some money, and he had made a lot of money on condos and things in Spain. And he and I looked at the property before Barb did, and we were in, because you could buy the stock in the Conrad Lumber Company and technically not buy the real estate. You would buy the stock that owned it. And so it was quite an attractive price at that point. Now bear in mind, a lot of those buildings were beat up and falling apart, just like mine had been.
You had bats.
Yeah, they had bats, and they had termites, and they had brick roofs that were needing work, and a lot of problems. But this investor, he said, Mark, this will take 10 or 20 years to turn it around and be highly successful. And they're right, it has been that long, but look at it now. But at that point, he said, Mark, I'm an older guy, I'm not going to live that long. He said, and I know you're young and enthusiastic, but I can't wait that long to have a return on my investment, and which he was correct, you know. But Barb honestly did some ideas that I had. Not that I told her particularly about them, but she had the same sensitivity to kind of go in some directions I thought were smart. Yeah.
So how would you describe DeLand to somebody thinking of maybe moving here? How would you classify it?
Well, there's all sorts of people moving here. I'm certainly a cheerleader for DeLand, as I am for Lake Helen. The two communities are very different and want to be different from each other for sure. But I see DeLand as the best of the old Southern tradition without the negative side of the Old South, or let's call it the New South. I mean, you know, you walk downtown, people will still open doors for you. They'll say hello. It's friendly. You know, you feel good. You kind of trust the place. You feel safe most of the parts of town. The university's been a huge influence, as you and I discussed that idea of the moral force. When you think about the KKK used to be in this area, you know, and DeLand was, Stetson was one of the bulwarks against that kind of violence and negativity. And I think a lot of people come here because it is the kind of town it is, you know. It's kind of that simple. It's a good lifestyle. It's pretty healthy. A lot of parks and recreation, the river, all of that makes it, you know. So I think it's pretty attractive. I am kind of concerned about all the tract houses out in what used to be country and grove land, and particularly if they become gated communities because they become their own entity, which is a little bit separate and alienated from downtown. That's where I think the Historic Society does a great job of talking about history and what used to be here, so that people that come into town respect that and start to enjoy that and kind of encompass that or integrate that into their own thinking also.
So what do you see
You know.
as sort of your legacy? I'm required to ask that question, by the way.
Boy, that's a tough one. I guess I really enjoy historic preservation of all types, and I seem to be I'm still in business. I mean, I'm 76 years old. It's like, come on, buddy, hang it up. But I really enjoy antique hardware and architecture, and I like people help. I'd enjoy helping people fix up their houses. You know, when we're done here, I'm going to a lady's house in Lake Helen who wants to buy some flooring antique for her house. But I really insist on looking at her flooring so we know we can match it, because she's got to patch it, and I want it to look right for her, you know. And I just enjoy that. And so I think historic preservation is just my ticket. I zigzagged through life and thought I was going to be an Episcopal priest. I thought I was going to be a school teacher. I thought I was going to be a professor, you know, and you kind of go like this, and that's okay. I feel good for everything I went through, for sure.
So your advice to a young person trying to figure out what to do?
Oh, I can tell you, just do what you love. If something appeals to you, that's what you ought to be doing. Don't get forced into a box. I will say, don't get married and have kids too early either. You know, that once you get married and have kids, I think your element of freedom starts to reduce, and you got responsibility you have to take care of. And I think the longer you can hold out, the better to find yourself.